Here we're going to look at 4 different ways to blend exposures in Raya Pro. Now, one of these ways, which is Rapid Blend If in the Quick Blend panel, I never use. It's really quick and really easy, but it doesn't give us as much control as other options. The second one I'm going to show you is gradient masks, which are really useful in scenes when we have flat horizons. So I do recommend using gradient masks when you need them. Outside of that, we're not going to talk about instant auto blending. We're not going to talk about apply image. We're not going to talk about precision masks. That's because all of these are for beginner to intermediate users. And I want to take you straight onto Instamask. And that's where the real power lies in exposure blending. We get so much more control using this panel than we do any other options in Raya Pro. So essentially, I want to get you from beginner to advanced in a very short space of time. So with that in mind, let me show you the different ways we can blend exposures in Raya Pro. So if I choose Quick Blend, and now we have a dark exposure here and a brighter exposure on top. So this is our base exposure on the bottom. And you can see the interior of this shot is entirely overexposed. So a quick way to blend exposures, we can just leave this layer visible and we can press Blend If Dark. And so now we've blended those exposures. Very quick and very easy. Conversely, if you wanted to blend your brighter exposure, we can swap these exposures and we can keep that visible and choose Blend If Bright. All we need to do is make sure that we have the exposure that we want to blend selected and we choose the correct button. So you can see that's really easy. But again, I don't recommend it. And the main reason why I don't recommend it is because the blend changes depending on how we alter these files. So I often like to use clipping masks and attach them to our exposures because it's a very non-destructive way of doing things, but that will affect the final blend. As you can see, it changes how the blend if option is calculated and it comes out with a strange result. But when we're using masks, we don't have that problem. So let me now show you gradient mask. Gradient masks works the same as a GND filter or a graduated neutral density filter. And it's great when you have a flat horizon like this. So we have darker exposure on top and a base exposure on the bottom. And I just want to take the sky from this darker exposure and put it at the bottom. Now this example is also included in your free tutorial. If you click on this button, you can see how all the buttons in this panel work. So to use the gradient mask, we just select our darker exposure and we click mask. And now we've created that gradient mask. You can see we're affecting the sky and we're affecting less of the foreground. So this is the mask that we've created. But because the mask becomes dark gray around here, that means we're going to get much of this darker exposure all the way along here, most of the image. So when we make the darker exposure invisible, you see we are affecting some of the jetty in the foreground. So if we want to fix that, we can simply press Refine and we can shift the edge any way we want. So if we shift it back, you see it goes up a little bit. And if we create more contrast, let's say 15% roughly, we now have a more contrasting mask. So most of the sky is going to come through from the darker exposure, but almost all of the foreground isn't going to be affected in the base exposure. So now this is the before and after. So you see we've brought through that cloud, but we're not affecting the jetty. So this is a really useful tool when you have a quick couple of images you want to blend which have really flat horizons. But we're not going to go into detail about these anymore in this tutorial. The rest of the time we're going to focus on Instamask so that we can become much more advanced in exposure blending. So let's talk about apply image. Now, apply image is exactly the same as luminosity masking. There's no real difference apart from we don't paint in any exposures. We just apply our mask directly to the layer. So we have 3 exposures here. We firstly have a really bright exposure on top. We have a dark exposure in the middle. And then we have a base exposure, just as you've seen previously. And again, you don't have to follow along to these. There are no images. This is just theory right now. But I promise we're going to get into the actual exposure blending very soon. So to use apply image, all we do is generate our mask. So let's say I'm going to generate a very general luminosity mask. Now I want to make the foreground a little bit darker and the sky a little bit brighter. It's just a little bit more contrast, not too much. Now I simply select the darker exposure and I press apply. And that's it. And now I can press show layer, and that's the blend. I can bring the opacity of the darker exposure down a little bit so it looks a bit more natural. And that is before and after. And here's the mask that we created through Instamask. And by using apply image like this, we are working with 16-bit masks. If you're working in 16-bit mode, I'm just working in 8-bit here. But if you're working in 16-bit, then you're using fully the 16-bit masks Instamask creates by using apply image. If instead we use luminosity masks, which use an active selection, then we're using an 8-bit process. And that's because all active selections in Photoshop are 8-bit and not 16-bit. But let's look at using apply image for the brighter exposure. So now we choose the brighter exposure. I like to make the brighter exposure visible. And again, we're going to talk about that later, so don't worry if you're not sure why I'm making some exposures visible and some invisible. Now this time we want to choose the shadows. So I go to darks 1 and I want a general mask, and that looks good. So again, I choose the layer I want to apply the mask to and just press apply. And then I can bring that exposure all the way down to make it look more natural. We don't need the foreground really bright. In fact, having it dark like that adds to the mood of the image. So there's the before and after. And we're still avoiding any underexposed areas. So after blending, that's the base exposure, and that's after blending. Now, do you remember when I said with Rapid Blend If, I didn't like it because you couldn't add clipping masks to the images? Well, with apply image, you can do that. So if we bring up the opacity so this sky's dark, I can choose a curves layer, create a clipping mask, and I can brighten or add more contrast to that layer as I see fit, and it doesn't change the blending process. I could even open up, let's say, a photo filter layer, and why don't we make it a little bit pink or violet? And now I make that a clipping mask, and you'll see that has changed the sky to a pinky red kind of sky. But notice that it's not affecting the foreground at all. And that's because we're taking the sky from the darker exposure, and the foreground is coming from the base exposure and the brighter exposure. So by adding the clipping mask, we've given ourselves more control over the final image. So that's why I prefer applied image and luminosity masks when exposure blending. So if apply image is so useful, why do we use luminosity masks? Well, the great thing about luminosity masks is that they allow us to make really fine changes without affecting the rest of the image. When we use apply image, we apply the mask to the entire image. But in luminosity masks, we can be selective about where we apply the mask. So here, from a scene shot in Dubai, we have a brighter exposure, but the lights are overexposed, and then we have a darker exposure on top where the lights are correctly exposed for. So if I go to Instamask, all I'm going to do is go to, let's say, a Brights 3. Now that's going to select mainly just the bridge here. If I chose Brights 1, that would be too general a selection. You see, we're going to affect the sky. Brights 2 is a good selection of the bridge, but it might also affect the sky up here. We just want to affect the lights on the bridge. So I could actually just bring down this slider here, and that would select just the bridge. But instead, why don't I just go for Brights 3? Now to make this into a selection, we just press select. Now you can see we have marching ants along the bridge. So I can hide the ants. I can press black M to create a black mask on this layer. Show LA, which means show layer. And now I want a white brush because my mask is black. And a brush of about 500 pixels, which I already have. I don't need a big brush because I'm just painting in some of these areas here. And you see we're bringing back the overexposed areas on the bridge. And we're not affecting the sky around it or anything else. So if I wanted to, I could also blend in the lights on the side of the road. But for now, let's just concentrate on the bridge here. So this is before we started blending, and this is after. So before it was entirely overexposed, and now we've brought back the information there. Now I actually think that that's probably a little bit too dark, so I would bring the opacity of that darker exposure down a bit so that we still have information, but it still keeps that brightness. Another benefit of luminosity masks is we can paint over the same area multiple times to strengthen its effect. So here's an image that I've used in the free tutorials showing you how to use Instamask. And let me show you a good comparison between apply image and luminosity masks. So here's Instamask. If I choose Brights 1 and bring up the slider a little bit to make it more contrasting, and then I choose apply on the darker exposure, we've done a good job at bringing back that sky. But look at the water here. Look at these lines. And that's because we didn't do a great blending job, because there's movement between these exposures in the water. So this is the mask that we created. You see, the mask is also a little bit too dark in the foreground. Now we could just paint that in manually. That would be fine if we just chose a white paintbrush, because we want to take the sky from the darker exposure and the water from the darker exposure and blend it in with the bright exposure. So that's the final image. That's what we should be looking for. But with luminosity masks, we can simply open up Instamask, create the same luminosity mask as we did before when we applied the image. We can press select, black M, show layer, hide the marching ants, and a big white brush. And now I can just paint in that darker exposure. And again, you'll see in the water, we do have that strange blending. And that's because once you paint in like this, you paint in the exact same mask as you did in Instamask. Now notice I'm not taking my finger off the left mouse button. So it's all one big movement. So there's our mask. And that's the one we created in Instamask. But if I choose the mask again, and I haven't deselected the active selection, everything's still the same, and I stop painting in this foreground, you see we're strengthening the effect. Now I can go over the sky if it needs it, and I can go over the water again, and I can go over the water a few times to make it stronger. And each time we're strengthening that luminosity mask effect. So now look at our mask. It's much whiter in the water than it was previously. And this looks okay. The blend looks extremely natural. We don't have any strange things going on in the water. Now, we can, of course, keep going and make sure that we've fully painted in that darker exposure. But I don't think it's necessary here. I think this final blend looks very good. So those are the four main ways we can blend exposures in Raya Pro. We can use Rapid Blend If, gradient masks, we can use apply image through Instamask, or the luminosity mask function in Instamask. Now, in case you're curious, the apply function in Instamask is exactly the same as the apply image option in quick blending, but we just don't have the flexibility that Instamask gives us. So it just applies the mask directly to the image, and that's it. You can, of course, experiment with this and see how it works, or you can watch the tutorial associated with this panel. In terms of precision mask, that uses apply image as well, but it creates all different masks so you can choose which mask works best for you. But of course, we don't need to do that because we have Instamask, and we can choose our masks any way we want, and we can test those masks before applying them. Now, if you don't know how to test masks, or you're unfamiliar with the actual functionality of Instamask, please click on this link at the bottom here and watch the tutorial.